Kirby talked about the initial purpose of the group for going to Palestine and Israel. And for me, it was, like I guess my other colleagues, important to see what was happening on the ground. You hear a great deal about this issue, but like most things, without some form of direct observation, you can't appreciate the gravity of that situation. I think at least one of the people that we saw, or the village that we visited, one young man has been shot dead since we've been back. Several people from these areas have been arrested. They were people like most of us sitting in this room, leaders in civil society, educators, intellectuals, community organizers, and to show you that this is an ongoing and even escalating problem. The question for me was, what is this issue about? What is its fundamental conflict? What is it about? And it seems to me what we don't talk about much in this country is about what are the security issues on both sides of the debate. What we often hear is the argument that Israel has a right to defend itself and it has legitimate security issues. But there's no mention of anyone else, certainly no mention of the Palestinians, and whether or not they have legitimate security issues. And when, in fact, you think about what's happening in that part of the world, what's happening between the Israelis and the Palestinians, is that it is a conflict fundamentally over land. Who is going to own the land? Who will distribute it? Who will benefit from the issues from the land, from the produce from it? And who will be able to control the movement of people within certain territorial boundaries? And it's clear that the Israelis in this regard have the upper hand. They have the momentum and they have the solid military and material support to push their issues. And I think this depiction on the screen of demise of Arab share of the territory and the expansion of the Israeli share of the territory tells the story in large measure. So therefore we have to look at what kind of state is Israel. Israel is, of course, a Zionist state, the mixture of politics and religious notions, the notion of Zion, being able to return to Zion, to go to a homeland. This is not particularly new. There were movements, of course, among African Americans that had a Zionist notion of Zion, to go to the homeland, to go somewhere else. There's one writer, Honor Bontemps, once said, any place but here. Any place but here. Somewhere where we could be free and secure. That's part of what drove the movement, some of the movements in the 1960s. And so that the Zionist state is related to the emergence of the Zionist movement in Europe in the 1880s and the 1890s by radical Jewish nationalists and other philosophers, and had limited traction at first. But we're concerned about the same thing. Where can we go to be secure? Where can we go to be in our own place, to develop as our own house? Interestingly enough, one of the areas that was considered as a point for Zion was in Africa. Uganda in East Africa. Now that would have been an interesting development, setting these Europeans down into this black environment. But in any event, it did not happen there. So Israel is a Zionist state, but it's an ethno-nationalist state as well, which means it proclaims its project is to develop a Jewish state. Not just a state where one can be secure, but a Jewish state that has relevance not only for the people who are going to live there, but for other people who are Jewish elsewhere. And perhaps it may have even now as much, or if not a bit more, interest for the people who are abroad. You hear many people who are Jewish say, I'm not going to Israel, but it's important for me that it's there if we need to somehow go there. And so this Zionist state is based on a process of settler colonialism. That's why settlements are at the heart of the debates going on. Coming in this morning, I heard the news report on Al Jazeera, and Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that he will not surrender the largest settlements in the West Bank. So it's not just a matter of sharing the land, it is who's going to, in fact, control it. And here you see the settlements going into the West Bank, which by everyone's recognition are Palestinian areas, what limited areas that are left to them. And here are settlements. Right after the UN vote on the recognition of non-voting status for the Palestinians, Israel announced that it was going to build several hundred more settlements. So settlements are the issue. How is it that the Palestinians can ever hope to have anything like a contiguous state if there are these settlements peppered all through? And the settlements are a trigger for the Israeli Defense Force deployment of checkpoints. They argue that these settlements become national responsibility for the protection of the people who have gone to move into these settlements. And the people moving in, many of them themselves are these active radical nationalists and also radical Orthodox Jews who are doing it as the front line of Jewish representation or Jewish position in the Palestinian area. So it's antagonistic from jump street. There's an antagonism and therefore an internal contradiction. On the one hand, Israel says it wants peace, security, and harmony and relationship with its neighbors, but at the same time it's expanding all the while. And as an expansionist state, it therefore constantly is pushing the boundaries of conflict with the Palestinians. And I think this is important. The Palestinians are essentially an unarmed population. Whatever else you want to say, they are relatively unarmed. They have no army, no armored vehicles, no Tomahawk helicopters, no Air Force, and no army of any sort. They have militant or guerrilla fighters or whatever you want to refer to them at with rifles for the most part, and some rudimentary mortar or limited rocket firing materials or weapons. And I mean, that is in fact the issue. Now, when we think about, just one other point about the use of violence here, Israel has used internal guerrilla tactics in the 1940s to push for the UN Resolution 181. At one point, organizations like the Irgun, the Haganah, were underground groups as well, in which Menachem Begin, Ben-Gurion, Ariel Sharon, all of them were equally involved. So the notion here of so-called terrorists or guerrilla fighters, who many of these Palestinians perceive themselves as, is shared on both sides of the history of these people. But what does it mean in exchange terms for the two groups? The Israelis, as settler colonists, expand, and their development is at the direct consequence of the undevelopment and insecurity of the Palestinians. Their expansion. And as they expand, they also control the best strategic positions in the country as well. The settlements are often up on the highlands, overlooking the Palestinian villages. The villages that we visited, the settlers and the government control the flow of water and sewage services, and that the Israeli settlers will have 24/7 use of water and sewage disposal service, and the Palestinians sometimes get on the average of only several hours a week for supply. So there is this fundamental and internal contradiction that leads that more for one is mathematically less for the other. Now on our trip there were some who said they felt that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict felt like the African-American and U.S. situation in terms of segregation and apartheid. It is in that regard, but it is more accurately like the U.S. and the Native American analogy than it is the U.S. and African-American. Thank you.
I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what I saw and some of what I learned, and try to focus towards the end on the role of women and the impact on women and children. But there are a couple of important things that I wondered about and that I was anxious about before going. Now bear in mind we had 23 delegates. A dozen were African Americans, 11 were white folks, of whom I think 8 were Jews and 3 were non-Jews. We had 2 rabbis, we had 5 ministers. We had some heavy hitters in terms of people who have a lot of experience in the civil rights movement, people who've been involved in the peace movement, people who have been involved in human rights work, education, and activism. So it was quite an interesting delegation. And one of the things I wondered about going was how people would relate to me as an American whose government has been unconditionally supporting the policies of the Israeli government, and also as a black person. How would the Palestinians relate to us? I don't know how many folks in this room are aware that sometimes there's a sort of latent question on the minds of black folks around how do other people of color relate to us? Do they see themselves as having a similar experience? Do they see us as very different? What's the base of their information? And so I went with some questions about that, and also how the women in the delegation would be related to what we would see as the role of women there, and how we would be able to participate, or what would be possible cultural constraints on how we would be able to show up. So these were on my mind. So one of the important things I learned is, first of all, that the policies of the Israeli government and the military actions do not reflect the views and interests of all Israelis. That was a very important piece for me to experience directly. And as in the United States, there are Israelis and Jews around the world who are appalled at the continued occupation and the building of illegal settlements on Palestinian land and the building of the security fences. So I know that that's an important piece for me to hold on to, that what the Israeli government does or a particular administration does not necessarily reflect the will of the Israeli people or all of them. So that's something to bear in mind. The second was that for me, I have learned pretty strongly that criticism or condemnation of that government and its supporters is not the same as condemnation of Jewish people, and that I have to say that. I actually have to say that. It's really important for me to make that distinction. I come from a family, I come from a lived experience of the role of Jews in my life as some of the most outspoken and brave people my family knew, who spoke out against all kinds of injustice and were allies in the civil rights movement and other social justice movements. So my experience of the heart of Jewish people in my life has been, very inspiring. And so I need to be able to ground myself in knowing that I can criticize a government just the same way that I criticize my own government. My government does not always act in my interests. A lot of time it's not acting in my interests, and it's not asking me for permission to do it. So I hang on to that way of grounding myself in what I want to say. I also wondered about how Palestinians would feel towards us as black people going, and especially as Americans whose government is doing things that support the occupation, and whether they would look down on me with hostility or disrespect. And I want to say that they did neither, that I learned how deeply Palestinians identify with us as people of color and as people who have been fighting for generations to gain liberation here. And their word for this quality of persistence is sumud, and sumud means steadfastness. It's an attitude of just staying put, and that has inspired me and strengthened me coming back. I also saw that artists and activists and organizers study Martin Luther King, they study Gandhi, they study Mandela, they study Tutu, and they can quote them chapter and verse. And so this image on the wall is not unusual. You see quotes from King, you see quotes from Gandhi and Tutu and Mandela all over the place. And this is part of what sustains the very unique Palestinian nonviolent resistance movement and their Israeli allies who stand with them in this resistance. So the last thing was that I wondered about the role of women. I had an image of Israel and Palestine as socially conservative, with distinct roles for women versus men. And I wondered how we would be able to participate when we met with people, and what would the role of women there be. Over 50% of the people that we met with were women. The activists, the educators, the organizers, the people who take direct action, the people who are counselors, the people who are attorneys. We met with tons of women, and both Palestinian and Israeli women. Very powerful women. And when we moved into the West Bank and into the villages, although the villages have a different flavor from each other, they each have a sort of unique culture, the role of women is prominent in each of the places that we went to. And women and girls are held in high regard, and that was important to me. when we went to Birzeit University, the majority of the faculty and the majority of the students are women, and they produce a lot of very powerful leaders from that university. This person is Fatima Audwa. Fatima has been a refugee in the Dehesha refugee camp in Bethlehem since 1947. She's about 95 years old now. She's been living there all that time. And we had a chance to interview her. She saw her village destroyed and erased from the map. So this goes back to some of the history that Kirby was referring to and Dr. Turner was referring to. These are Palestinian women on the streets of Ramallah, just to give you a flavor of how people look in an urban setting. They're modestly dressed for the most part, but also very stylish. These are young women at Birzeit University, students that we met with who gave us a tour of the university. This is Ruth Edmonds. This is an Israeli woman who is part of the Israeli Committee Against Housing Demolitions. This committee keeps track of and documents where land, especially in the East Jerusalem area, but also throughout the West Bank, is being confiscated through the demolition of Palestinian-owned properties, what happens to the people, and how that changes the neighborhoods. So she took us on a tour of East Jerusalem and showed us some of the similar kinds of maps that Kirby showed us. These are two Palestinian women who were raised in the United States, Sahad Baba and Irene Nasser, and they are part of actually it's a Jewish-owned production company called Just Vision, and they produce documentaries about the struggles in Palestine and also about the attempts of Israelis and Palestinians who've lost people to the violence to meet each other and find common humanity. These two people are an Israeli and Palestinian woman. The person on the left is Gabi Lasky, and the person on the right is Sahar Francis. Gabi is a Jewish woman born in Mexico. Sahar is a Palestinian. And they're both human rights advocates who work directly with families and especially with people who've been taken into administrative detention. Administrative detention is a special set of it's a criminal justice system and court system that is designed to, it functions primarily to arrest and try Palestinians. Gabi works a lot with the young people who have been arrested, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. These are people at an organization called Sabil. These are Christian Palestinians. And the woman in the red shirt is Salwa Duaibis, and she is a counselor who works directly with the women who have been, who've had their homes demolished or whose children have been arrested. And so we learned a lot here about the ways in which young people, young Palestinians are treated as distinct from how young Israelis, people who are legally minors, are treated. So I'll say a little bit about that. There are quite a few reports, and it's documented that Palestinian children, usually between the ages of 14 to 17, but sometimes as young as 12 years old, are arrested, often in the middle of the night. The most usual charge is for throwing rocks. They are blindfolded, they're handcuffed. Many of them report being transported on the metal floor of a jeep or a vehicle to a detention center. Often they're held in solitary confinement. They don't get to meet with their parents or lawyers while they're interrogated. And sometimes they're not brought before a judge for charges for at least 4 days. Some of them have been kept in solitary confinement up to 30 days. So this is clearly a violation of the rights of children. And what is often being extracted from the children under this kind of duress is that they're asked to implicate the adult members of activists in their villages. And they are sometimes signing statements against those people who are their relatives or their best friend's dad in a statement written in Hebrew, which they don't understand. So this is a way that activists are continually harassed and suppressed. I think I'll leave this for Margot. This is Shahab Weisbein and Annaline Kish from an organization called New Profile, Israeli women who are working against the militarization of Israel. These are folks in the village of Benin. This is, I think, Maya Bernat and her dad, Ayad Bernat. Ayad is one of the leaders of the resistance movement there, where people engaged in several years of nonviolent demonstration to gain back some of the land that was confiscated for the building of the security fence. And Maya takes people on tours of the area where the demonstrations took place and shows us the tear gas canisters and whatnot left there. This is a gathering of the Palestinian women and women in the delegation in the village of Budrus. The young women of Budrus wanted to protest. In Budrus, they were protesting, again, the confiscation of land and the bulldozing down of their olive trees in order to make way for the security fence. They actually successfully won back some of their land, and the young women wanted to take part. They're very modest. They have a pretty traditional lifestyle there. All of these young women are college students. Education is a huge value in Palestinian society, and they were active in those demonstrations. Now, these are some of the young men who are the most vulnerable for being arrested in the ways that I talked to you about. And one of the impacts on the young people who are arrested, especially the young boys, is that what we heard is that from counselors and the lawyers, is that after detention, after they've been interrogated and handcuffed, blindfolded, humiliated, they often come back to the village, lose interest in school, and sometimes display some bullying behavior towards their younger siblings, will act out the role of the interrogator, and while they have a lot of bravura, a lot of macho behaviors in the daytime, they wake up in night sweats, and they have nightmares, and they're wetting their beds. So there's a traumatization that the young people are experiencing that is also not easy for them to get attention for, because they are also being pressured to see themselves as heroes because they've been through this difficult situation. These are some of the children from Budrus. This is a demonstration in the village of Nabi Saleh. I hope you can see that at the front of the line there are women, there are children walking. People of all ages take part in this demonstration. As Dr. Turner said, the control of water is critical. This is a very dry place. And these folks have a spring on their land. A lot of their land was confiscated to build a settlement, and every Friday they demonstrate in order to gain access to the spring. They only have water from the spring 7 hours a week, and the spring is actually now being located behind the line of the neighboring settlement. Two little girls. These are the women of Nabi Saleh. A number of them have been arrested and detained. And I think that's it.
Good morning. I'm Margot Hittelman. I'm another of the senior fellows at the Dorothy Cotton Institute. And for me going on this trip, I lived in Israel in the late 1970s and early 80s. I had been back to visit a couple of times. I lived there briefly, I visited there during the years of the First Intifada, but I had never been to the West Bank before. And when people ask me, in a sentence or two, what the trip was like, what I have to say is it was very important for me as an American Jew to go, and very powerful to go with this group of people. I understood one narrative very well. During the trip, I came to understand another narrative equally as well. And what I also came to see, and this is the part I want to share, was we had the opportunity to meet a large number of people, both Israelis and Palestinians, who had come to know well each other's stories and each other's traumas, and were working to figure out how to build a new society. And when I've come back to the United States, I find that often people either know one side of the story, or they know another story, or they found it difficult to look at the story as well, at all. But what was so powerful and moving was meeting people who were trying to figure out how to get from where they were to a new society that would include everybody. I thought, given that we're honoring Dr. King today, I would remind us of what his notion of love was, that comes out of many of the traditions of nonviolence in the world. And I hope the revolution doesn't count on technology, because I'll tell you my computer crashed this morning with the exact quotes. But the essence of it was that justice without love is hard-hearted, and love without justice is merely sentimental. And that the two notions are very much entwined. And many of the nonviolent activists that we spoke with spoke to us in some way about their goal being not just to end the occupation, but to envision the society that would come after. That there would in fact be a day after the occupation ended, and that just simply ending the occupation was not their goal. And so I'm going to share with you a couple of those stories, because since I've been back, especially in times of the escalation in Gaza, people have said to me, did you see any hope? And the answer, it was these people that I met who did in fact have the vision of a society that they were working towards, which is what gives me hope. This is Daoud Nasser. Daoud is a Christian Palestinian who lives on land that his family has farmed since 1916, land purchased under the Ottoman Empire, that they now call the Tent of Nations. And you've heard many of the stories of struggle. Daoud had his stories of struggle as well. They've been trying to hold on to their land, surrounded by Israeli settlements. They've been in and out, mostly in court, trying to hold on to their land. The Tent of Nations operates under the slogan, "We refuse to be enemies." When you first arrive at this farm in the hills outside Bethlehem, you come upon painted stones that have the slogan, "We refuse to be enemies." And Daoud has been creating what he calls a place of encounter, where people from all nations, including Israelis and including Palestinians, can come to what is essentially a sustainable permaculture farm that they are using to hold on to their land and hear each other's stories, but more importantly, work the land together, come to understand the importance of land, both to the Palestinians and the Israelis, and work to create something that is sustainable and different. And he said that those were his essentially two goals: to bring people together, to learn, to meet, to refuse to be enemies, and to find a different way of existing on the land. This is one of the many young Israelis we met, Sahar Vadi. Sahar was probably in her early 20s, and she talked to us a lot about growing up during the Second Intifada, when suicide bombings were a huge part of her everyday reality, and the militarization of Israeli society was part of her everyday reality. That as children in schools, the counting sheets that children have where you have pictures and you have to match numbers. And their pictures might have been one bird and 2 tanks and 3 soldiers. So that from a very, very young age, the militarization of Israeli society is part of everyday reality. But at age 13, her father took her in some work he was doing in the Israeli peace movement to a village in the West Bank. And she went back many times, and she talked to us about learning to understand other realities and learning to understand the Palestinian reality. And in fact, at 18, when she reached the age when young Israelis are required to go into the military, she went to prison instead of going into the military, and has currently worked with a number of organizations against the militarization in Israeli society. And she told us the stories that about the level of fear in Israeli society, about the legacy. Dr. Turner spoke of it, of a society founded at the end of the Holocaust, at the end of the near annihilation of an entire people. And she says to her grandmother asks her, you know, this work you do against the occupation for a different kind of state, where are you going to go when the Palestinians come back? When you know, it looks to her grandmother like the state's about to end. And her response was, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying here. This is my culture. This is my country. This is my society. This is my city. I'm not going anywhere. But if you want your great-grandchildren to live here, then it needs to look different. And so we heard that a lot from young Israelis working. This is our country, this is our society, but we can't live in a society that is oppressing another people. And so one of the important things that I came to recognize is something that Dr. Vincent Harding named for us on our trip. And what he did is he referred to a comment that Thurgood Marshall said about the United States. And that was that the U.S., that our struggle in the U.S. is the contradiction of a group of slaveholders and slave traders trying to create a democracy. And the struggle that the Israelis face is the contradiction in Israel's founding, which was the notion, and this is the myth on which Israel was founded, of a land without people for a people without a land. And what young Israelis have had to come to look at is the founding of their state wasn't a land without people, even if Jews were at the time of the founding a people without a land, and that's what they're struggling with. And then the final thing that I want to talk about is the role for us as USers. This is a picture of a tear gas canister. We saw many of them. They're used in the protests, in the nonviolent protests. If you look at it closely, it says Made in America. But what we heard from people is also a plea to look at our roles and the role our country plays, and to begin to ask the question, who makes a profit on militarism, and how do we act on that? That it can be very easy to simply say, our country's backing the actions over there, and they need to stop. But what we were asked is to also reflect more deeply as USers on what are the roles and interests of the US in it. And so one of the things Sahar pointed out to us is that something like 60% of the US budget is military expenditures, and we provide $3 billion in aid to Israel. But 75% of that aid must be spent on buying arms from US countries. And for those who don't know, in many parts of the world, 100% of our aid to other nations must be spent on buying arms from US companies, US companies. And so we were asked to look at the way that the US government subsidizes the US arms industry. And to shift our focus from the fear that's perpetrated in our country, the fear that we see perpetrated in Israel, to the huge profit to be made. And since 9/11, this profit goes both ways. Israeli companies have made a huge profit on the technologies they developed for urban warfare. We buy our drones based on Israeli technologies, and the fence between the US and Mexico that's being built is based on Israeli technologies. So our own government is spending a whole lot of money on supporting the arms industries and on buying technologies that our country wants to have as well. And so we were asked to look at that, and that was an important understanding for me. So finally, in closing, on the right is Cedar Davis, part of an organization called Sabeel, which is a Christian liberation theology organization. She is what is called an internal refugee. Grew up in Palestine, still lives within the borders of Israel in Jerusalem without the original home that she had, and lost many things at the time of the founding of the state. Two things she said as I close. One was, and I was talking about coming to understand each other's narratives well. She talked to us about the understanding she has developed about the Holocaust, about 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, about the establishment of the State of Israel. But what she said has stuck in my mind a lot. And she said that in the West, there has been a beginning of a grappling with an understanding of what happened with the annihilation of Jews in Europe and the role of the Christian church in supporting that, and the Western guilt in setting up the State of Israel, but that it was paid for out of the Palestinian pocket. That was very important for us to understand. But she also talked about something that brings us back to the kinds of things Dr. King talked about, that her hope was that the path forward would involve not just the people in the region who have to figure out their future together, but a role of the West in walking with one arm around the Palestinians and the other arm around the Israelis to the river of healing. And that any progress forward had to be made back to the notion that love without justice is merely sentimental, but justice without love is hard-hearted. And that there needs to be a vision of the humanity of all the people in the region who need to figure out their future together. At the same time that we need to be unbending at standing up and speaking out about the injustice that's being perpetrated.
So we have just over 20 minutes, and if people can just shout out questions, I'll try to list them, and then we'll continue. Okay.
Can you pick a
Well,
question, Kirby? I
was
can't see the
gonna propose that
questions.
we turn the questions and maybe we take turns as panelists answering.
I would start with the original allotment of land.
The original, don't know. Going back to the...
Okay. Original allotments were made for what was called then limited immigration, and they were made to settlers, to Jewish immigrants who were coming to settle.
One thing to just know some about the history is, Palestine was called Palestine. There was an Ottoman Empire that controlled the territory. It's a region of the world where empires cross and empires go, and so it's been under the control of other people for a very long time. So that's one thing to just keep in mind. After the Ottoman Empire, then it was under control of the British Empire. And then, sort of in that transition, when the European world was deciding that maybe colonialism was a bad idea, there were other ways to steal things from people. That were more efficient. I mean, that's right. In that cross-section of time, while the world was kind of deciding that, it used the same mechanism to say we're going to hand this territory over to some other people to hold it. And on some level, that's just a historical thing to remember. So the behavior there was pretty common for the world. They just sort of decide that this land belonged to somebody else. And so Palestinians who lived in that territory, many of them were driven off in 1947 or 1948. So that's the original allotment of land is a little tricky to hold because also a lot of Jews lived there. A lot of all sorts of people lived there, but it was not being controlled by you could frame it as the indigenous people until perhaps even now, depending on how you look at it, how you answer that question. One of the things that I showed people was a village that had been demolished. It was called Lista. We went and visited it. There are places throughout Israel and the West Bank where you can see villages that have been demolished, and the way that you know that is there's this cactus that people used to use as sort of border things around their houses that just won't die. So it grows back up again, and you can see where the villages are.
I'm going to add one last thing that's often not said, but at the period that the State of Israel was established, there were uprisings for democracy throughout the Arab world. And the West also had an interest, as we have in many places in the world, to not see that in fact happen. That the U.S. and Western's imperialistic interests have often resided on countries not being democratic, so that we have some control over rulers. And so there's a lot to understand about history, but I also think that one of the things we saw and heard is there's a lot to say about looking forward. And somebody asked about the one-state solution. We heard people who had different positions. We did meet a large number of the activists we met, both Israelis and Palestinians, were interested in a one-state solution. There are other people who weren't. And by the one-state solution, that would be a binational democratic state that extends from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, the entire elements of the land, where both Israelis and Palestinians are living in a democratic state that's not a nationalist, or is not a religious nationalist state.
There were two things I wanted to comment on. One was, I think, the question about how demographic change is also impacting Israel. And one of the key things that is the differential in population expansion. And the Palestinians are having a higher birth rate. And the immigration, both the birth rate and the immigration of new settlers, even though settlements is a big issue, is fallen off from what its high had been a generation ago. And so that it's making it very difficult for those people who want to see a secure Jewish state consider a one-state solution in which they would perceive that Jews might become a minority. So this is a factor. And a one-state solution, and I think a resolution in that area is going to have to be disengaged somehow, and this is extraordinarily difficult, as I know you would appreciate, from the concept of a Jewish state. One last observation. I have not seen in my life any time when a group of people are in conflict over one arriving where others are living, that there's ever been any recognition that people were there. The argument you recall in this history is that the Native Americans weren't there. They just weren't there. And if they were tucked off in some forest, not doing much good. Not, as John Wayne said, not using the land to any benefit. The South Africans argued the same thing, that they landed at the Cape and there was no one there. They stopped moving up north and they ran into people later. always it seems that the notion of settlements and settlers is that the argument that no one else was there. So it was this notion of a land without people and a people without land. It's sort of idyllic, and it removes the complex context of what's happening to other people. And then the attendant to that notion is always not recognizing that there were people who uprise against that kind of intrusion and oppression. So you demonize them in almost every incident as terrorists, because it's the only way that you can morally and politically deal with occupation. These people are not legitimate political actors. They're not human beings. They are terrorists. And what we are doing is merely in defense of ourselves because we're under this kind of pressure.
We did meet Israelis who defended the status quo. We met with the leader of the Jewish community in a settlement in Hebron. This is a fellow who actually was raised in New Jersey, David Wilder. And he gave us a tour of a Jewish museum on the settlement grounds, and then talked to us after a while. And he is, I think, one who can give a good argument for the historical right to the land that Jews trace to biblical times, but also more recently to, whose question was this? Also, the more recent history of Jewish communities, ethnic communities within Hebron, where people had established a stable community. There was a yeshiva, there was a synagogue, there was trade, and that in the 1920s there was a massacre of people in that community. And so people were actually, the British mandate at that time said, well, we can't defend you, we can't protect you, and so you have to leave. And so within the lived memory of people's families is this experience of expulsion from having a community with deep ties right to that land. And so he talked about that. Also talked about the right of Jews to return to the land of Israel. And I think the argument is that the Bible shows an historical right to the land. So yes, we did encounter folks who are staunch supporters of the status quo and also of arming themselves. This man spoke to us for over an hour and had a very large Glock on his belt, and felt that it was really important to be armed, that he puts it on in the morning, doesn't take it off until he goes to bed at night, and that he knows people in his community whose lives have been saved because they were armed, and he knows of other people who died because they didn't have arms to defend themselves. So yes, yeah. What was the other half of that question there? Security benefits of the wall. Yeah, well, I think that for the people in the settlements and for people who are living on the borders, the sense of being surrounded or being in the midst of one's enemies and people who are angry and don't want you there is real. And so there is some sense that the wall provides a barrier over which it's pretty hard to, in some places the wall is 25 feet high. You know, there are places it's 12 feet high. It goes into the ground a meter. It's very thick. It's big, and it's got razor wire on it. So it makes it pretty difficult to cross it. But it's also not complete, and so it's possible to cross the wall. And sometimes the wall is, it's a little bit incoherent because it divides two Palestinian villages or settlements from two Palestinian neighborhoods. It makes it very inconvenient. And so are there security reasons? Obviously, somebody feels it makes it more secure. And I think that that's true. And unfortunately, it doesn't really prevent violence altogether. People can get through it, and some of the violence that happens also happens from people who are ostensibly being protected by it towards people who are on the outside and aren't seen as the enemies. So we heard both sides of that.
I think I'll add one thing about the wall in response to the question, and then maybe answer something about what do we take to our children. We may continue, I mean, there are probably a variety of views about the security of the separation wall. A couple things we heard was that, first of all, the wall is not finished yet. And yes, suicide bombings have dropped a lot. But it's also true that over the past period of time, the Palestinian Authority has decided, in part because of winning over world opinion, to move towards nonviolence. And so one of the questions that got raised for us is, was it actually the separation wall that reduced the suicide bombings, or a change in perspective within the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian society that reduced the suicide bombings? You know, at the same time, it's true that as USers, we do also need to remember and notice, you know, what's happened in our own country. We are not a country in which bombs have dropped very often, and when they have, as with 9/11, fear becomes predominant, and people allow governments to do things that they might not otherwise allow out of fear. And so there's a certain kind of humility that comes from how to stand up against injustice and how to work for justice without crossing a line of being judgmental against perpetrators of injustice. So your question about what do we take? One of the things that I took very much from this trip is that we're fed a lot about the difficulties. We're fed a lot in our media about the violence. And it's very powerful to remember that there are large numbers of people in this part of the world and in every part of the world working for something different. And one of the messages I would want to take to young people is the story about people working together for a new society. And one of the things I heard a lot, both from Israelis and Palestinians, in their story, is that the people working for nonviolence were often people who grew up in families that had modeled in some way, taking them as young people to meet across the boundaries of us and them. That they had seen something different as young people, that they had been encouraged, that they were taken, they saw their parents working nonviolently for something different. And probably one of the sad things I heard about the separation wall is that the creation of the wall created not just a physical barrier between the societies, but a virtual barrier, and has made that kind of encounter much more difficult for people. And so I would tell people that there are people really working to build up a new world.